What you're about to hear isn't political theater. It's a direct warning about what happens when the rule of law is replaced by fear. In this exchange, Representative Julie Johnson confronts Kristi Noem with a simple but devastating truth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this bill, but I want to go back to what happened in Minnesota, because I just think that this is so critical on so many different levels. There's new information coming out every minute. I'm tracking this very closely. I want to enter into the record an article from the Washington Post entitled, "ICE Agent Was Not in Vehicle's Path When He Fired at Driver." I also want to enter into the record an article from the New York Times that is titled, "Minnesota Officials Say They're Being Blocked from Investigating Fatal ICE Shooting."
Without objection.
And the reason I think this is very important is because we have video footage that is being shown across this country about what happened in Minnesota when Ms. Good was shot 3 times by an ICE agent as her car was being turned to move away. And we also have immediately, not days later, immediately, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who has billions of dollars at her disposal, taxpayer dollars, who has been using ICE agents to kidnap and disappear people across our cities, including US citizens, by the way, mass detention policies that have been ruled illegal by numerous judges across the country with no due process, which is what this committee is supposed to ensure that we have. And that Secretary of Homeland Security, combined with the President of the United States, within hours put out statements that were absolutely lies. And that's coming out now with all this video footage. And what happens, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, what happens is we live in 2 realities. We here in Congress are living in 2 realities, where we have one reality of what's happening to the American people. Healthcare is being stolen. We're invading Venezuela without authorization from Congress. Congratulations to the Republicans in the Senate who voted for the War Powers Resolution where it passed in the Senate on Venezuela. We are seeing a reality on television of an American citizen who was sitting in her car be violently approached by an ICE agent and then turning her car away and being shot 3 times. Not once, not twice, 3 times. When you have the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security now give an alternate reality to what happened, what you do is you undermine any trust that may have existed in the United States government, because that's who's saying these lies. And when you undermine the trust, and maybe this is the proposition that my colleagues across the aisle are okay with, I don't know. But when you undermine that kind of trust in our government, in our democracy, that is when you have lawlessness. And look, this isn't the first time. January 6th happened. I was in that gallery when January 6th happened. I couldn't walk, I had a cane, I just had a knee surgery, and I was one of the last people to be let out of the gallery. And to tell me that that didn't happen, that that was not a violent insurrection incited by the President of the United States, confirmed by a special counsel that he was absolutely trying to steal that election, is not just a disservice. That's too mild of a word. It is fundamentally undermining people's faith in government. Because when I see these articles that say ICE agent was not in the vehicle's path when he fired at the driver, and that is directly contradictory to what the President of the United States has said, how can we accept anything from this government, from this administration? He wants to set up an offshore account for Venezuelan oil that we sell. And I don't know, is he going to control that account? I have no idea. But I am deeply disturbed about this killing, about the lack of accountability from this committee, about the fact that members on the other side are defending this killing. And I think we have to think about the consequences to our democracy and to our judiciary system and to the trust in government. I yield back.
Julie Johnson directly confronts DHS Secretary Kristi Noem over what Johnson describes as systemic abuses by immigration enforcement agencies and a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law. Rather than framing the issue as a partisan or ideological disagreement, Johnson grounds her argument in constitutional principles, legal standards, and first-hand observations, arguing that current enforcement practices are actively violating due process and civil rights. Johnson begins by addressing what she sees as an escalating climate of fear across the country. She explains that this fear is not limited to undocumented immigrants, but extends to lawful residents, American citizens, and even law enforcement officers themselves. According to Johnson, this atmosphere is driven by rhetoric coming from the highest levels of government and filtering downward into enforcement behavior. She warns that such fear is dangerous because it erodes trust, destabilizes communities, and increases tension between the public and law enforcement. At the center of Johnson's critique is Secretary Noem's claim that DHS is restoring the rule of law. Johnson flatly rejects this assertion and explains that the rule of law rests on two core pillars: probable cause and due process. She argues that neither is being consistently respected. Johnson states that individuals are being detained or arrested based solely on appearance, particularly skin color, without any individualized suspicion or evidence of wrongdoing. She emphasizes that this practice is incompatible with constitutional standards and cannot be justified under any legitimate interpretation of lawful enforcement. Johnson further explains that due process, the right to a fair hearing and legal protections before being deprived of liberty, is being routinely denied. She describes cases in which individuals are detained for days without hearings, access to legal review, or meaningful opportunities to challenge their detention. According to Johnson, these practices represent a severe departure from constitutional norms and threaten the legal protections that apply to everyone in the country, not just immigrants. To support her claims, Johnson cites her visit to an ICE detention facility outside Dallas. There, she observed that more than 70% of detainees were classified at the lowest threat level and had no criminal history whatsoever. This directly contradicts repeated claims by the administration that enforcement efforts are narrowly focused on serious criminals or national security threats. Johnson argues that these findings expose a gap between official rhetoric and operational reality. The script also highlights the human consequences of these policies. Johnson recounts multiple incidents in which American citizens were detained by ICE despite clearly identifying themselves as U.S. citizens. Some were allegedly assaulted, suffering broken ribs, brain injuries, and other physical harm. In one case, an elderly man was reportedly knocked to the ground after asserting his citizenship, only to be detained anyway. Johnson stresses that such actions represent an alarming disregard for both civil rights and basic human dignity. While Johnson acknowledges that many ICE and Border Patrol agents perform their duties professionally and lawfully, she draws attention to the existence of bad actors who exceed their authority. She argues that leadership has failed to adequately discipline or rein in these individuals. According to Johnson, the lack of accountability sends a dangerous message that misconduct will be tolerated or ignored, further eroding public trust. A recurring theme throughout the script is oversight. Johnson emphasizes that congressional concerns have been raised repeatedly through hearings and formal letters, many of which have gone unanswered.